Joining me now from New Delhi is Shashi Tharoor. He was a career senior UN official, a close advisor to the late Kofi Annan when he served as head of the Department of Peacekeeping and as Secretary General, and he was himself a candidate to succeed him as Secretary General in 2006. A former Minister of State for External Affairs of India, he is since 2009 a prominent Member of Parliament for the Congress Party. Shashi Tharoor, the UN has had some successes in the last few years, but as you know, its reputation has also suffered quite a great deal over the last few decades. As a former Under-Secretary General for Public Information, do you see this as poor UN communication, or is it simply that the UN has lost its appeal, lost its luster, and many would argue its credibility, not just in the DRC, but in other places like Cyprus, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Western Sahara, Palestine, and the list is really long. Some of these conflicts had already, in fact, began when you started your career with the UN in the late 70s.
That's so true, Gita, and it's a long list. But, you know, the UN reflects the realities of world politics, even while it seeks to transcend them. The UN at its best and its worst is a mirror of the world. It reflects our differences and our convergences, our hopes and aspirations, as well as our limitations and failures. But the point is that to reduce it either to just a communications problem or a credibility problem, I think begs the entire question of how the UN is structured. It's the member states who run the organization.
Even if that is the case, Shashi Tharoor, I mean, it is a rather classic rebuttal, isn't it, to pin all of the failings of the UN on its member states, on the Security Council, on the permanent 5 members, isn't it?
Yeah, but it happens to be true. So if, for example, you need troops to enforce the Security Council's will in any of that long list of places you're mentioning, Gita, in every one of those cases, it's the member states who decide whether to do it, what the mandate will be, how it will be crafted, how many troops they're willing to pay for to send there, who's going to give those troops. So at the end of the day, if member states don't provide all of this, the UN has absolutely nothing of its own to do. So when you speak of the UN, remember the UN is both a stage and an actor. I think that's the most helpful metaphor. It's a stage on which the member states are playing their parts and making the decisions. And then you're sending out one actor, the Secretary General, to do things.
Hold on, but the Secretary General does have... Well, the actor, but he does have a very important role to play, doesn't he? Kofi Annan used to joke, as you know, that SG doesn't stand for Secretary General, but for scapegoat. But it's also true that Secretaries General too often hide behind member states, behind the Security Council. In fact, a lot of them self-censure for fear of reprisals by the P5s. They rarely speak out when it's controversial. I mean, we see that time and again, don't we? When did we see bold leadership from Ban Ki-moon or heard from the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres? The US is lacking leadership. Would you agree?
I don't want to characterize individuals simply because having been there for so long, I think anything I say would look like whatever. I've always been very aware that our great second Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, told us very memorably the UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. And sometimes that's the best the UN can do, to try and prevent us all from tumbling into hell. It's a worthwhile battle the UN is waging, but the world tends to judge it by standards it's impossible for any UN Secretary General to achieve. Now, you know, when you talk about, for example, the fact that some Secretary General are usually silent, that they don't speak, particularly when by speaking they might offend powerful member states. If you ask the question, why is that so? Kofi Annan had a superb answer when I was working with him. He said, there's an old Ghanaian proverb that my father taught me. He said, never hit a man on the head when you have your fingers between his teeth. I think that's a very memorable way of putting it. A Secretary General has 10 different issues. He needs to be on the right side of the key powers that are helping him deliver results. Now, if he's going to hit them on the head on one issue, there are 9 other things impacting millions of people around the world where he might lose their cooperation.
But there's one issue that we've been hearing about for decades. We've been hearing about Security Council reform for a long time. In fact, the last push for reform of the Council was by Annan 20 years ago, and it's been silence pretty much ever since. Can you see the day when there will be enough momentum to compel all the P5s to accept meaningful reform, enlargement of the Council to be more representative, abolishing the veto, or simply implementing, in fact, something that is already in the Charter, that powers on the Council recuse themselves when they are stakeholders or a party to a conflict?
As you know, they've never done that. And the irony about this is that power structures are rarely changed voluntarily. You need the world to make it impossible for a certain power structure to continue. We saw this in the World Bank and the IMF when the sheer pressure of the economic transformation of China meant they had to change their established power structure. Belgium had the same weighted vote as China did. Now, in peace and security, that isn't yet the case. You've got countries like Germany, Japan, India, South Africa, Brazil, saying we are now as indispensable to keeping the UN going around the world as the permanent five. So why shouldn't we be permanent members too? But the resistance is colossal. And the resistance is not only from the entrenched interests of the permanent five, it's also from those countries that feel resentful of others joining this exclusive club. You mentioned Kofi Annan 20 years ago. I remember Boutros Ghali 25 years ago in saying that at the 50th anniversary of the UN, he wanted to see Security Council reform done and dusted. And now we're coming up to the 75th anniversary. And what is worse, of course, there's nothing in prospect even by the 80th. But the truth is that the UN has responded to the world's demands upon the huge multidimensional peacekeeping operations that I was privileged to be part of. At my peak, I had 80,000 soldiers working for us around the world in the field. I've seen human rights becoming a subject that no member state wanted to touch into something that was absolutely core to the UN's behavior. Therefore, there is absolutely no question that the United Nations has been a highly adaptable institution that has evolved in response to changing times, and it can therefore adapt again.
Well, you say highly. Well, when you say highly adaptable, you say highly adaptable. Many people would actually vehemently disagree with you. In fact, it has shown that it's also been reluctant to adapt to a changing world. What do you think should be the UN's top priority moving forward now, as it attempts to, again, remain relevant in a world where multilateralism is under threat? It's the entire multilateral architecture that is under threat, isn't it? When you have the US withdrawing from WHO in the midst of a devastating pandemic, reneging on its climate change commitments, withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, where are we as an international system headed? Well, with right-wing divisive policies, I should add, that are gaining popularity not just here in the United States or in Europe, but even in your own country, India.
You put your finger on it, Gita. I think India is not a problem. India is still committed to the international multilateral approaches for the most part. But when it comes to what we've seen because of coronavirus, there is a general retrenchment. There are countries saying that they want to be more self-reliant, more protectionist. You're seeing the pulling back of international supply chains and production chains. Deglobalization is a new buzzword. And I do fear, very frankly, that I think multilateralism could be a casualty of COVID as well. And this is something which there's no easy answers to, because a lot depends on member states. When the US decided to pull out of WHO, it sent an ominous signal that essentially it no longer valued the incredibly indispensable ways, for example, in which the WHO has led the tackling of global disease and pandemics like this one. What I am concerned about with multilateralism is, will this tendency to be more protectionist, more nationalist, more into import substitution and all of that, will this translate itself into saying we don't need to cooperate with other member states? If that happens, it will undermine this magnificent experiment of 75 years. If tribalism, nationalism, isolationism are allowed to succeed and prosper, if the post-COVID world will be a world in which people say our sovereign states are so much more important than what any international cooperation will get us, then I really worry about the future.
All right, Shashi Tharoor, many thanks for joining us. A pleasure to speak to you as always. Thank you.
Thank you, Gita.